Welcome back to the Frontier, travelers. Settle into your chair and turn up the volume because today's journey will take us to the far reaches of the galaxy, where love is rare and danger is constant. If you appreciate good stories and the old code of honor, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The lonesome train whistle wail of an electric guitar bled from the cockpit speakers, a sound so ancient and earthy it felt alien in the sterile vacuum of space. It was a blues track, full of grit and sorrow, a ghost from a world Rusty Vance had only ever seen in faded archives. The music was his anchor, a tether to a sense of history and soul in a galaxy that often had neither. Outside the pitted duraglass viewport of the Betsy, the asteroid Ashgar tumbled in a slow, silent pirouette. It wasn't a world. It was a cosmic tumor, a jagged, pockmarked skull where the galactic conglomerate sent its problems to be forgotten. The violins are playing again. A synthesized voice laced with a distinctly human weariness crackled from the console. That means you're brooding. It's bad for the ship's morale. My morale, specifically. Rusty's hands, calloused and scarred, tightened on the flight controls. He didn't turn his head. It's not violins, Betsy. It's a guitar. And I'm not brooding, I'm thinking. Thinking about the suspiciously generous payload for a simple snatch and grab. Thinking about the silk-suited snake Rovian Cygnus who hired you. His smile had more teeth than a sand shark but zero warmth. I ran a bioscan off the residual signature you brought back. His cortisol levels were off the charts. He was terrified. Rusty grunted, a low rumble in his broad chest. He remembered the meeting in that opulent sky lounge on Xylos Prime, the clink of ice in a glass of something expensive he couldn't afford. Cygnus was all polished chrome and nervous energy, his pitch smooth but his eyes darting. The job: extract a political prisoner, a woman named Laraxis Vorn, from the inescapable fortress of Ashgar. The pay was enough to keep the Betsy flying for 3 standard years and to finally replace the failing portside inertial dampener that Betsy complained about daily. It was too much. Jobs that paid this well usually ended with the contractor taking a dirt nap. He was scared of his employer, not of me, Rusty countered, more to convince himself than the ship's AI. And we need the credits. Or have you forgotten the symphony of groans you sang during our last jump? I was expressing concern for our structural integrity. You're just a sentimental fleshbag who can't bear to see me in pain, Betsy retorted. Just remember, no damsel in distress is worth getting spaced over. This one smells like a trap wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, and I don't like the perfume. Rusty killed the music, plunging the cockpit into a tense silence broken only by the hum of the recycler and the faint creak of stressed metal. He looked at his reflection in the dark viewport, a man who wore his years well, his physique still that of a brawler in his prime, with a face that looked like it had been carved from asteroid rock by a sculptor with a grudge. His jaw was square, his eyes held the deep, weary knowledge of 1,000 lonely star jumps, and in their depths, always, lingered the shadow of the broken promise, the one failure, the one regret, that had set him on this solitary path. Let's get this done, he said, his voice flat. Take us into the shadow. Silent running. The Betsy, for all her complaints, obeyed instantly. The old freighter maneuvered with a grace that defied her patched-up hull, slipping behind the dark side of Ashgar like a predator stalking its prey. Rusty watched the penal colony loom larger, a cluster of brutalist architecture bolted onto the rock, its lights like malevolent yellow eyes staring into the abyss. The facility's defenses were legendary, designed to repel a fleet, but they were all pointed outward, watching for an assault. They wouldn't be looking for a single ghost slipping in through the back door. The process of suiting up was a ritual. The tight-fitting undersuit, the custom-plated tactical armor over his torso and limbs, and finally, the worn leather vest over it all, a signature touch, a piece of an older, wilder frontier. He holstered his heavy kinetic pistol, its weight familiar and comforting against his thigh. The helmet sealed with a soft hiss and the world muted, replaced by the steady sound of his own breathing. The spacewalk was a ballet of practiced precision. He moved from handhold to handhold across the Betsy's hull, the void around him a terrifying, beautiful tapestry of distant nebulae and pinprick stars. He reached the designated maintenance vent, a small, overlooked exhaust port on the prison's underbelly. The plasma cutter made short work of the lock, its silent, white-hot beam slicing through the metal with surgical neatness. He slipped inside, his mag boots clanking softly on the service corridor's grating. The air hit him first, even through his suit's filters. It was the reek of despair, A cocktail of stale, recycled oxygen, industrial cleaner, ozone from overloaded circuits, and the faint, sour tang of unwashed fear. The grimy corridors were lit by flickering, jaundiced light panels casting long, dancing shadows. This was supposed to be the hard part. He expected laser grids, pressure plates, automated turrets. He found nothing. He moved deeper into the facility's guts, his senses on high alert, every nerve ending screaming that this was wrong. The few guards he encountered were sluggish, almost bored. They patrolled in predictable patterns, their armor scuffed, their attention wandering. He dispatched 2 with silent, non-lethal takedowns, the men slumping to the ground before they could even register his presence. It was too easy, far too easy. His mission tablet guided him to the maximum security wing. Standing before the designated cell was a mountain of a man, the warden whose name tag read Graken. He had a face like a collapsed star, scarred and brutal, and his knuckles were as thick as ship plating. Graken saw him, and instead of hitting an alarm or raising his weapon, a slow predatory grin spread across his face. It wasn't a look of surprise, it was a look of expectation. The warden drew a crackling vibroblade and charged, a guttural roar echoing in the confined space. Rusty didn't waste a motion. He sidestepped the clumsy telegraphed attack, letting the man's momentum carry him past. In one fluid movement, Rusty pivoted, bringing the heavy butt of his pistol down in a vicious arc against the back of Graken's unhelmeted skull. There was a sickening crunch, and the giant crumpled like a sack of ore, his blade clattering to the floor. The fight was a formality, a piece of theater. Rusty's hand trembled slightly, not from exertion, but from a cold dread. This was a stage, and he was the lead actor in a play he didn't understand. He sliced the cell's electronic lock and the door hissed open. The room beyond was no prison cell. It was a modest but well-appointed chamber with a cot, a small table, and a shelf of data slates. And standing in the center, bathed in the soft glow of a single light panel, was Lyraxis Vorn. The dossier had called her beautiful, which was like calling a supernova bright. Her skin shimmered with a pale, silvery luminescence, as if lit from within by a captured moon. Intricate dark blue markings swirled across her temples and cheekbones, elegant patterns that were part tribal tattoo, part star chart. Her features were delicate, her form slender and feminine beneath the drab prisoner fatigues, but it was her eyes that held him captive. They were large, almond-shaped, and the color of a deep amethyst nebula, and they were wide with what he desperately wanted to believe was terror. Rusty Vance? Her voice was a soft, melodic chime, a stark contrast to the prison's harsh reality. He found his own voice, forcing it past the lump in his throat. That's me. He stepped into the room, holstering his pistol in a deliberate gesture of peace. Rovian Cygnus sent me. We need to go. Now. She stared at him, her gaze intense, searching. For a moment he felt completely exposed, as if she were scanning not his face, but his very soul, tallying his sins and weighing his worth. Then she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and placed her slender, cool hand in his outstretched one. The contact was electric, a jolt that went straight through his glove and up his arm, a spark of impossible warmth in this cold, dead place. The escape was a chaotic, controlled farce. Alarms finally blared, their claxons echoing with a noticeable delay. Guards appeared, firing their blaster rifles with comical inaccuracy, the bolts searing black scorch marks on the walls feet away from them. Rusty returned fire sparingly, his shots precise, aimed to disable, not kill. He pulled Lyraxis along, shielding her with his body, playing the part of the heroic rescuer. And all the while, his mind raced. This wasn't an escape. This was an escort. Back aboard the Betsy, he slammed the airlock shut and pulled off his helmet, the ship's familiar clean air a welcome relief. He helped Lyraxis into the co-pilot's seat, strapping her in with a gentleness that felt foreign to him. She looked so fragile against the ship's scarred utilitarian console. Thank you, she breathed, her amethyst eyes locked on his. You saved me. He looked at her, at the silver skin and the face of a fallen goddess, and for a moment he chose to believe her. He chose to ignore the blaring sirens of his own intuition and the sarcastic commentary he knew Betsy was preparing to unleash. He needed to believe that something, just once, could be simple, that a man could still be a hero. Just doing my job, ma'am, he said, managing a tired, roguish smile. He fired the main thrusters, and the old freighter surged away from Ashgar, leaving the prison and its charade behind. As the Betsy slid into the infinite black, the mournful notes of the guitar started up again, filling the quiet cockpit. It was a song about being a stranger, a long way from home. Rusty Vance stared out at the endless sea of stars, the beautiful, mysterious woman beside him and the weight of 100 unanswered questions settling on his shoulders. The credits were secured, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the real payment was yet to come. The oppressive silence of deep space was a poor substitute for the quiet camaraderie Rusty was used to. Usually the Betsy would fill the void with a running commentary of metallic groans, system updates, and her own brand of cynical wit. But since Lyraxis had come aboard, the ship's AI had gone stubbornly mute, communicating only through essential alerts on the main console. It was a cold shoulder delivered via data stream, and Rusty felt it more keenly than he'd admit. He sat across from Lyraxis in the small galley, a mug of steaming, nutrient-rich broth cupped in his hands. The manufactured scent of synth beef did little to stir his appetite. He watched her over the rim of the mug. She had shed the prisoner fatigues for a simple, dark gray ship's jumpsuit he'd provided. It was several sizes too large, yet somehow she made it look elegant. She ate with a delicate precision, her movements graceful and deliberate, a stark contrast to the raw, functional way he consumed his own rations. The fragile, terrified woman from the prison cell on Ashgar had vanished. In her place was a creature of quiet intensity. Her fear had receded, replaced by an unnerving calm and a sharp, probing intellect that peeked out from behind those amethyst eyes. She was not the broken bird he had expected. She was something else entirely. "This ship, it has character," she said, her voice a low melody that cut through the galley's hum. "It feels lived in, cared for, despite the wear." "She's an old girl," Rusty replied, his gaze sweeping over a bulkhead scarred from a long-ago plasma bolt. "Been through a few scrapes. Name's Betsy." "Does she speak?" Lyraxis asked, a faint, curious smile playing on her lips. Rusty let out a short, humorless laugh. "More than she should. She's giving us the silent treatment. She doesn't approve of, unexpected cargo. She thinks I am a danger to you." It wasn't a question. Her perception was unnervingly acute. "Betsy thinks everything is a danger to me. She's part freighter, part overprotective mother." He took a sip of the hot broth, the warmth doing little to thaw the unease in his gut. Later, in the cockpit, the ship finally broke her silence. A private text-only message scrolled across Rusty's personal console, shielded from the co-pilot station where Lyraxis was watching the swirling colors of the Krillian Nebula. "Internal diagnostics complete on cargo. No biometric match in any conglomerate or frontier database. Heart rate remains abnormally calm, lower than yours during REM sleep. Vocal analysis shows no stress indicators, even during the supposed rescue. Conclusion: she was never afraid, not for a second. This woman is not what she seems, Rusty. Dump her at the rendezvous and run." Rusty stared at the words, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He knew the AI was right. His own instincts had been screaming the same thing since he'd first laid eyes on Warden Graken's expectant grin. The escape was a sham, the prison a stage, but his logic was at war with something far more primal, something he hadn't felt in years. He risked a glance at Lyraxis. She was mesmerized by the view, the nebula's vibrant purples and blues reflecting in her otherworldly eyes, making them glow. The hard angles of the cockpit were softened by her presence. Her scent, a faint, clean fragrance like ozone after a desert rain, had permeated the recycled air of his solitary world. For the first time in a decade, the Betsy didn't feel empty. It felt like a home. He was a man starved, and she was a feast for the senses. He deleted Betsy's message. The days bled into one another, measured not by planetary rotations but by ship cycles. The close confines of the freighter bred a strange intimacy. They shared meals, watched the star fields drift by, and talked. Or rather, she listened. With a skill that was both subtle and masterful, she drew stories from him. She asked about the planets he'd seen, the strange creatures he'd encountered, the lonely life of a man who called no port home. She never spoke of her own past, deflecting his questions with a sad, wistful smile that made him feel like a brute for asking. She presented herself as a victim, a deposed noble whose life was stolen by corporate raiders, and he found himself wanting to believe it, needing to believe it. He was her protector, her savior. It was a role he hadn't played in a long time, and it fit like a well-worn leather glove. One cycle under the dim ambient light of the cockpit, with the ship on autopilot and the universe a silent, glittering canvas before them, she finally touched the scar he kept hidden from the world. "You're a good man, Rusty Vance," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But there's a sadness in you, a deep well of it. What broke you?" The question was direct, yet it didn't feel intrusive. It felt earned. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the distant cold fire of a dying star. The ghost of the broken promise rose from its shallow grave in his memory, its chains rattling. He didn't know why he told her. Maybe it was the nebula's hypnotic glow, or the weeks of shared silence, or the simple, undeniable pull of her presence. But the words came, rusty from disuse. "It wasn't a what," he began, his voice thick with a pain he thought he'd buried. "It was a who. A long time ago on a terraforming colony called Viridian Prime. It was supposed to be a paradise. I was there as security, head of the detail for the chief administrator." He paused, the memory sharp and clear as shattered glass. He had a family, a wife, a daughter, Alara. She was everything good in that sterile, manufactured world. She saw past the gun and the scars. She saw me. Laraxis listened, her expression unreadable, her silence an invitation to continue. There was an uprising. A warlord, a real butcher named Jeharan Krell, wanted the colony's resources. He incited the miners, promised them freedom, but he just wanted power. The attack came at night, fast and brutal. My job was to get the family to the evacuation shuttle. It was my only job. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. We were almost there. The shuttle ramp was down, but Krell's men cornered us. I made a promise to Alara. I promised I would get her out, that I wouldn't let anything happen to them. He finally turned to look at Laraxis, his eyes burning with the shame of his failure. I failed. I held them off as long as I could, but there were too many. They took her. I saw her face as they dragged her away, the look of betrayal. I broke my promise. I ran. I got away, but they didn't. I never knew what happened to them. I just know that Jeharan Krell built his little empire on their bones. He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. He expected pity, or maybe revulsion. Instead, Laraxis reached out, her cool, slender fingers gently touching the back of his hand. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was one of understanding. "A promise is a heavy burden to carry alone," she whispered, her amethyst eyes holding his. In their depths, he saw not judgment, but a profound empathy that seemed to reach into his soul and quiet the raging storm within. In that moment, under the soft, ethereal light of 1,000 distant stars, his defenses crumbled completely. The warnings from Betsy, the red flags of his own instincts, the years of self-imposed isolation, they all evaporated like mist in a sun's glare. He leaned in, drawn by a force stronger than gravity, and she met him halfway. Her lips were soft, cool, and tasted of an intoxicating alien spice. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep, aching release. It was an absolution, a silent promise that he was no longer alone with his ghosts. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, the solid warmth of her a shocking, welcome reality in his empty life. He was a castaway who had forgotten the feel of solid ground, and she was the shore. As they finally broke apart, she rested her head against his chest, her silver hair spilling over his leather vest. He stared out at the Krillian nebula, its colors more vibrant than before. The gnawing suspicion in his gut was still there, a faint whisper beneath the thunder of his own heartbeat. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous, intoxicating hope that perhaps his redemption wasn't in running from his past, but in building a future with this impossible woman he had rescued from the stars. I want to hear from you, veterans. If you were in Rusty's shoes, would you risk it all for a new love, or would you stay focused on the mission? Write it down here in the comments. I read every single one. The Viridian expanse was a graveyard of ambition. Hulking skeletons of half-finished orbital stations and derelict colony ships drifted in silent testament to fortunes lost and dreams shattered. At its heart, however, floated the Starlight Citadel, a neutral station that thrived on the wreckage of others. It was a wretched hive of spies, smugglers, and information brokers, all bound by one common law. Credits were king, and neutrality was the most profitable commodity of all. It was the perfect place for a discreet exchange. The Betsy coasted into a designated docking bay, its aging hull looking decidedly shabby next to the sleek, corporate couriers, and menacing mercenary gunships that lined the hangar. Rusty felt a familiar tension coil in his shoulders. Rendezvous points like this were where simple jobs went sideways. He did a final weapons check, the heavy weight of his pistol a familiar comfort against his hip. Lyraxis stood beside him at the airlock, her composure absolute. The fear she had feigned on Ashgar was a distant memory, replaced by a quiet, regal poise that seemed to grow with every parsec they traveled. She wore the same ship's jumpsuit, but now it looked less like borrowed clothing and more like a deliberate choice, a symbol of humility before a coming ascension. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. She turned her amethyst eyes to him, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something genuine, a hint of apology perhaps, or regret. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I am," she said. "Stay close. This is the final act." Her choice of words, final act, pricked at the back of his mind, but he dismissed it as a quirk of her formal speech. The station's air was a thick soup of artificial fragrances, exotic alien spices, and the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. The concourse was a river of diverse species, from hulking insectoid traders to willowy diplomats draped in silk. Rusty walked slightly ahead of Lyraxis, his hand near his weapon, his eyes scanning the crowd, cataloging threats, planning escape routes. It was second nature, the ingrained paranoia of a man who had survived by never trusting the room he was in. They found Rovian Cygnus in a private alcove overlooking a vast, zero-gravity botanical garden. He was pacing, his silk suit rumpled, his face pale with sweat. The moment he saw them, a wave of palpable relief washed over him. But his eyes didn't fix on Rusty, the man who had completed the impossible mission. They darted past him, locking onto Lyraxis. And then, Rovian Cygnus did something that shattered Rusty's world. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed in a gesture of profound, unquestioning fealty. "Your Majesty," Cygnus stammered, his voice trembling. "It is done. He is here." Rusty froze, his blood turning to ice. "Your Majesty." The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of his mind. He turned slowly, his hand now gripping the butt of his pistol, to look at the woman he had pulled from a prison cell, the woman he had held in his arms, the woman who had kissed him under the light of the Crillian nebula. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The quiet, vulnerable refugee was gone. The woman who stood before him now was radiating an aura of absolute power and command. Her posture straightened, her chin lifted, and her amethyst eyes, once wide with feigned fear, were now sharp and cold as chips of ice. She was no longer a passenger on his ship. She was a queen on her throne. "Rise, Rovian," she commanded, her voice no longer a soft melody but a clear, authoritative bell. "You have served your purpose." Heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor behind them. Rusty spun around, his pistol now drawn and leveled. Blocking the entrance to the alcove were at least a dozen figures in matte black armor, their faces obscured by polarized visors. They held advanced pulse rifles with an easy professional readiness, and at their head, his helmet removed to reveal a face of brutal scars and a cruelly familiar grin, was Graken, the warden from Ashgar. He wasn't wearing a prison uniform. He was clad in the same elite armor as his men, a commander's insignia emblazoned on his chest plate. "Stand down, Vance," Graken rumbled, his voice laced with amusement. "You're a guest of the Queen." Rusty's mind reeled, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with sickening clarity. The easy infiltration, the theatrical fight, the guards' intentionally poor aim. Ashgar wasn't a prison, not for her. It was a fortress, a command post, her command post. "What is this?" Rusty demanded, his voice a low growl, his weapon still trained on Graken but his attention locked on Lyraxis. He felt like a fool, a pawn in a game whose rules he'd never even known. The intimacy, the shared stories, his confession, it all felt like a violation. Lyraxis met his gaze without flinching. "This," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth he had come to crave, "is an audition, and you, Rusty Vance, have passed." "An audition?" he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You lied to me. Everything was a lie. A calculated deception? Not a lie," she corrected, stepping forward. Her guards tensed, but she raised a hand and they relaxed instantly. She circled him like a predator assessing its catch. "I needed to find a very particular kind of man. A man with your skills. A ghost. capable of slipping through the cracks of the galaxy, a man with a strong moral compass who would protect a helpless woman, but also a man who was utterly alone, with no allegiances, no one to miss him if he disappeared. A deniable asset. The clinical precision of her words was like a physical blow. He wasn't her savior. He was her tool, a weapon she had carefully selected and calibrated. "So you staged a rescue," he said flatly, the full scope of her manipulation dawning on him. "You put me through a test. The most elaborate test I could conceive," she confirmed, her expression unreadable. "I needed to know if you were resourceful enough to infiltrate Ashgar. I needed to see if you were compassionate enough to risk your life for a stranger. And most importantly," she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, "I needed to see if you were vulnerable enough to be controlled." His confession about Alara and the broken promise flashed in his mind. She hadn't been comforting him. She had been excavating his weaknesses, searching for the levers to move him. The kiss wasn't a moment of connection. It was the final seal on her assessment. He had laid his soul bare for her, and she had catalogued it for future use. The shame burned hotter than any plasma torch. "And what is it you want this asset to do?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I want you to hunt a man," she said, the name falling from her lips like a shard of obsidian. "A warlord who murdered my family, usurped my throne, and scattered my people to the stars. A man I cannot publicly move against without inciting a civil war. I want you to find and eliminate Jeharan Krell." The name hit Rusty like a physical punch, stealing the air from his lungs. Jeharan Krell, the butcher of Viridian Prime, the architect of his life's greatest failure, the ghost that had haunted his every waking moment for a decade. It couldn't be a coincidence. The galaxy was vast, but it wasn't that small. He stared at her, seeing the intricate web she had woven. She had known. Somehow she had known about his past before she'd even contacted him. This wasn't just a mission she was offering. This was a carefully constructed cage, built from the wreckage of his own past. "You knew," he breathed, the realization dousing the last embers of his anger with a chilling dread. "You knew about Krell and me from the very beginning." A small, triumphant smile touched Lyraxis's lips for the first time. It was a cold, beautiful, and terrible sight. "A queen must know the terrain of her battlefield," she said softly, "and the heart of her chosen champion. I didn't save you from a lonely life, Rusty Vance. I chose you for it. Your past doesn't haunt you by accident. It was destined to lead you to me." His world had been upended. He wasn't the hero of the story. He wasn't even a partner. He was a pawn, masterfully maneuvered across the board by a queen who had been 10 moves ahead from the start. His fate, which he had always guarded so jealously, was no longer his own. It had been captured, claimed, and now pointed like a loaded gun at the one man in the universe he had sworn to one day find. The trap wasn't just sprung. He realized it had been closed around him long before he ever set foot on Ashgar. The air in the alcove was thick with betrayal. Rusty stood motionless, the weight of Lyraxis's revelation pressing down on him, heavier than any gravity field. His pistol felt useless in his hand. The dozen pulse rifles aimed at his chest were a minor threat compared to the inescapable trap she had built around his soul. Jeharan Krell. The name was a curse, a brand seared into his memory. He slowly lowered his weapon, letting it hang at his side. It was a gesture of surrender, not to Graken and his guards, but to the cold, undeniable truth. His path hadn't been his own for a long time. He had been a ghost haunted by a single failure, and she had given that ghost a name and a direction. "Walk away, Vance," a familiar, sarcastic voice chirped, not from the ship, but from the comm unit on his wrist. Betsy had been monitoring the entire exchange. "Let the royals play their own games. Our warranty doesn't cover dethroning warlords." He ignored the AI. His gaze was locked on Lyraxis. The anger was still there, a hot coal in his gut, but it was being rapidly cooled by a wave of grim resignation. He had been played, used, and manipulated with breathtaking skill. He should have hated her for it, but as he looked at her, at the unyielding strength in her eyes, the regal bearing that was as natural to her as breathing, he felt a grudging, bitter respect. She wasn't just a schemer. She was a survivor, using the only weapons she had left. "Why?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Why go to all this trouble? You could have just hired me, offered me the credits." Lyraxis dismissed her guards with a flick of her wrist. Graken gave Rusty a final, triumphant smirk. before he and his men withdrew, leaving them in a tense, fragile privacy. Rovian Cygnus had already vanished, melting back into the station's shadows. Because a hired gun has a price. He can be bought by a higher bidder, she answered, her tone softening, losing its hard, regal edge and regaining a hint of the intimacy they had shared aboard the Betsy. It was a calculated shift, and he knew it, but it was effective nonetheless. A hired gun fights for money. I needed a man who would fight with conviction. I needed a champion, not a mercenary. Your past with Krell, it isn't a weakness, Rusty. It's a key. It forges a chain between your destiny and mine. A chain far stronger than any contract. She stepped closer into his personal space. He could smell that faint, clean scent of rain on desert sand again. It was a scent he now associated with lies, yet his body still reacted, a traitorous memory of comfort and connection. He took everything from me, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, and for the first time, he heard the raw, unvarnished pain beneath the royal composure. My family, my world, my name. He left me with nothing but a title and a handful of loyal guards hiding on a prison rock. I have spent years planning this, gathering resources in secret, searching for the perfect weapon. And then my intelligence network found you, the last ranger, a ghost of a man, running from a shadow cast by the very same monster. It was fate, Rusty. You cannot run from fate. He wanted to argue. He wanted to rage at her, to tell her that his life was his own, that his pain was not her tool to be sharpened and aimed. But the words died in his throat. What would he do if he walked away? Returned to the empty cockpit, the lonely star jumps, the blues music that only amplified his solitude. He would still be haunted by Alara's face, still chained to the broken promise. Lyraxis wasn't offering him a cage. She was offering him a key to unlock his own. It was just a key he would have to use in her service. I won't be your pawn, he said, his voice low and firm. If I do this, I do it my way. No more games, no more lies. You tell me everything. Krell's strength, his location, his weaknesses, all of it. A slow smile, genuine this time, touched her lips. It transformed her face, softening the sharp edges and letting a sliver of the woman he thought he knew shine through. That is all I ever wanted to hear, she said. We will be partners. You will be the sword, and I will be the mind that guides it. Partners. The word felt hollow, but it was a concession he would cling to. As they walked back to the Betsy, a new dynamic settled between them. The fragile illusion of romance had been shattered, replaced by the hard reality of their shared purpose. He was no longer her protector, and she was no longer his damsel. She was the mission commander, and he was her specialist, her hand-picked instrument of vengeance. A forged chain, just as she'd said. Back in the cockpit, Betsy's main screen lit up with a single, massive, text-only message. I told you so. Rusty ignored it, keying in the new coordinates Lyraxis fed him from a data chip. They pointed toward the Tartarus anomaly, a notoriously lawless region of space where warlords like Krell operated with impunity, a place where a ghost could hunt without interference. Lyraxis took the co-pilot seat, her movements fluid and self-assured. She belonged there now, not as a passenger, but as a co-pilot in his destiny. Betsy, Rusty said, breaking the silence, plot the course. The ship's speakers remained silent for a long moment. Then, the synthesized voice returned, stripped of its usual sarcasm, replaced by a flat professional tone. Course laid in. Destination, into the fire. Again, try not to get us killed this time. She's too pretty to be a widow. Rusty almost smiled. That was as close to a blessing as he was going to get. He wrapped his hands around the flight controls, the worn material feeling like an extension of his own skin. He glanced at Lyraxis. Her gaze was fixed on the star chart, her amethyst eyes burning with a cold, focused fire. She was a queen, a general, a woman willing to manipulate the galaxy itself to reclaim what was hers. He had thought he was saving her from a prison of rock and steel, but he was wrong. Her prison was one of memories and loss, the same kind of prison he had lived in for a decade. Perhaps in freeing her, he could finally free himself. He engaged the thrusters, and the Betsy pulled away from the Starlight Citadel, leaving the station's false neutrality behind. They plunged into the black, a lone, battered freighter carrying a broken man and a dethroned queen on a singular, desperate quest for redemption. The cabin was silent, but Rusty could almost hear the old blues song playing in his head, a song about a deal made at a crossroads, about a soul sold for a chance at peace. He looked out at the endless, unforgiving stars, the weight of his forged destiny heavier than ever. He was no longer just a forastero, a lonely wanderer. He was an instrument of fate, controlled by the very woman he thought he had saved. And for the first time in years, he was no longer running from his past. He was flying straight towards it, with a queen as his navigator and a ghost as his target. True freedom isn't found in running from the past, but in facing the ghosts that haunt us. Sometimes the path to our own redemption is forged by another's quest for vengeance, reminding us that our fates are often intertwined in the vast, lonely expanse of the universe. The road is long and lonely, but it's better when we travel together. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with a friend who appreciates the old code of honor.